Hello again, it's Steve Smith here, and today's presentation is called Assessment. I think assessment, when I began teaching, didn't seem the most interesting of things to me. I was far more obsessed with preparing nice lessons and controlling classes and just teaching my subject, and assessment felt like something that almost got in the way of what I wanted to do. But as time went on, as I learned more, I realized actually it's a very important part, an aspect of our job as a teacher, to understand what assessment is about and the role it plays. So I think probably this is one of those where it's probably aimed more at younger teachers or teachers who are in training, but more experienced teachers may also learn something from this as well. So to start with, I guess the question to ask is, why do we assess in the first place? And I've come up with a few bullet points here, and they're kind of in an order of importance. Certainly, the top three to me seem to be the most important, and obviously, the top one there is about getting information for you and for your students about how they're progressing, where their strengths and weaknesses are they meeting expectations, do they need to work harder? So that's obviously really important to you. What may be less obvious to you is the fact that a test in itself is a very good example of retrieval practice and what the cognitive psychologists call the testing effect. And research shows that the testing effect is very powerful for learning. When we force ourselves to retrieve information from memory at a certain level of difficulty, it can't be too easy nor can it be too hard, then that in itself reinforces learning. So if you see any sort of test, whether it be a high-stakes kind of exam or a quiz or a vocabulary test, whatever it might be, then it is providing useful retrieval practice. And we know as teachers as well that when you tell students that they're going to be tested, it does provide an extra motivation to learn. And for many students actually, that is a very, very powerful motivator. For those who might not be particularly interested in the subject, nevertheless, the necessity to do well in an exam for their future needs, or simply the desire to do well, is a very powerful motivator in itself. Of course, there are other reasons why we have to assess. Sometimes you simply have to do it because the school has a system and you have to work to that system. And of course, there are statutory requirements to be fulfilled. For example, national exams, the GCSE in England, for example. And in addition, in many educational jurisdictions, maybe most, you need to assess to gather data for teacher accountability and school accountability purposes. That's certainly a powerful factor in England. And there's the very practical issue of providing certification. So that's important for students' future to have evidence of a certain level of achievement. So that's just my little general introduction on why we assess. I'm now going to have a look at two types of assessment. The first one, formative assessment, and then in a second I'll look at what's called summative assessment. That picture, by the way, at the bottom there is Dylan William, who is the researcher most associated with formative assessment, or as it's also known, assessment for learning. Actually, he makes a very subtle distinction between the two, which I'm not going to go into here. But whether you call it formative assessment or assessment for learning, it's, as someone put it once, it's like tasting the soup as you go along, as opposed to evaluating the final version of the soup. So formative assessment, therefore, is an ongoing process, and it happens usually informally during lessons as you interact with classes. So it's about constantly weighing up what the students know and what they need to do next to make further progress. I quite like the new label that's been applied to it by some people. Notably, there's a writer called Harry Fletcher Wood who's called it responsive teaching, a term that Dylan William has also mentioned, I think, as well. And to me, that makes more sense as a teacher. Responsive teaching makes more sense to me than assessment for learning, which still has that ring of testing all the time when you talk about assessment. So to me, it's about responsive teaching. It's what good teachers instinctively do to check the temperature of the class, to respond to every little moment in the classroom, what students say, are they listening to you, and then you'll be aware of some of the tricks of the trade, for example, using interactive whiteboards or response systems, digital response systems, if you like those, to find out how the class is responding. And, if I could recommend one book to you about this, it would be the Teach Like a Champion book by Doug Lemoff, who gets into the nitty-gritty of how you can interact with classes and establish this sort of responsive teaching. So the formative assessment then is a key part of every teacher's armoury. Summative assessment then is usually more formal. It may be a requirement, therefore, of your school or syllabus. It usually occurs at the end of a unit, and it produces scores or grades, often judged against mark schemes, or the Americans call rubrics, which allow you to see a student's progress. And students perceive it as important quite clearly, and as I mentioned, it can be used as a motivator. So it is a powerful source of extrinsic motivation as opposed to intrinsic motivation. It gives you a sort of instrumental reason to want to work, even if you're not intrinsically interested in the subject. And let's face it, some of our students, even the hard workers, aren't incredibly interested in our subject. That's something you have to accept. By the way, just to go back to formative assessment, when we talk about giving scores or grades, is it a good idea to put marks, to put grades on work? Well, the research that comes out of formative assessment is very clear on this, and it says that actually, no, it may even have a negative effect. And classically, students will look at the mark and then ignore any other comments you write, or not look carefully at any corrections you've written in. Having said that, each school has its own system, and if within a school grading is a part of the culture and students expect grades, then you may feel a need to do that. And certainly as a teacher in the schools I worked in, there was a culture of grades, and I went along with that, but tried to incorporate in lessons moments when students had to look through corrections or write corrections or respond to any comments that had been made. And often a grade can be a nice shorthand as well. If you have, each grade represents a certain descriptor, then you can use grades in different ways. Let's put it that way. In the literature about assessment, we talk about three things: validity, reliability, and practicality. Let me tell you what that means. So a test is valid when it tests what it purports to test. So in our subject, for example, if you want to test listening skill and you use second language questions to assess the listening, then students are also having to decipher the meaning of the written text first. Similarly, in a listening test, if they had to write answers in the second language, then you're testing their writing at the same time. So in that sense, it's not a valid test of listening. So validity is important. Validity means that a test should be well constructed. It should be in a format that students are already familiar with, that can be doable in the time they've got. It needs to be clear and uncomplicated and be relevant. So all of those things come into play when you talk about the validity of a test. Now, on the other hand, researchers talk about reliability of a test. So this means, is it robust? Does it produce consistent results? Can you depend on the results? And that can depend on a number of factors, including who is marking the test. So there are some sorts of assessment which are clearly more objective and more reliable than others. So, for example, multi-choice and true-false produce right or wrong answers, whereas any sort of assessment that's based on a mark scheme which is level-based, and this typically would apply to oral exams or, for example, to written essays where the marker has to decide what category that quality of work falls into, that is bound to be less reliable, because all the research shows that even the same teacher on the same day can allocate different marks to the same piece of work. Teachers are human, they are subjective, and in that sense subjectivity is the enemy of reliability. But beware, because even so-called objective tests like multi-choice have their issues. For example, when you design multi-choice and you need a minimum of 3 possible responses, if the test is designed in such a way that the 2 wrong answers are clearly wrong and aren't even in play, then that's not going to give you a reliable assessment of the student's ability. or achievement. So that's why when exam boards, for example, Cambridge, pre-test multi-choice, they try and get something like, let's say, 70% of students get the right answer, and then about 15% get one of the wrong answers, and the other 15% get the other wrong answer. So in other words, you need to have each of the options in play, and clearly there's a great art about designing multiple choice tests for them to be reliable. So we've mentioned reliability, we've mentioned validity, and there's also the question of practicality. And for us language teachers, does the testing interfere with normal teaching? For example, how practical is it to give a speaking test to every one of the 30 individuals in your class? If you want that test to take at least 5 minutes, that takes up quite a bit of lesson time. So teachers often have to look at ways of assessing which don't interfere with normal teaching. A really practical everyday consideration is, can the students cheat? And students cheat. So when you set up a test in a classroom situation where they're seated close to each other, a very practical solution is to make sure that students, for example, put a bag up on the top of their table so that their next door neighbour can't possibly see. It's important that you monitor extremely carefully during a test that no one is cheating. And unfortunately, students cheat. And at the moment, as I'm delivering this little talk in 2020, when we're in confinement, there are issues obviously with remote teaching and how can you reliably assess, and in particular writing when students have access to things like Google Translate. So there are certainly issues to do with remote teaching when it comes to practicality. I kind of hinted at this earlier on when I talked about validity of testing, and this is when we talk about discrete and mixed skill testing. So let me explain this. A discrete skill test is one which isolates the single skill being assessed. So as I mentioned earlier, if you want to assess listening, you ideally would not want to include any written language or spoken written language that could interfere and produce, if you like, an unfair, unreliable result of purely listening skill. Mixed skill testing, sometimes called multimodal or integrative testing, involves where you're testing a student but across more skills at once. Usually in the classroom we use mixed skill activities, but in many exams listening is tested in a largely discrete fashion. So for example, in England and Wales and Northern Ireland, in the GCSE, the listening test is a relatively discrete form of testing. We test listening separately, reading separately. Although there are imperfections in that, as anyone who works with these knows, but essentially you're splitting up the 4 skills. Whereas if you teach A-level, one of the papers is listening, reading, writing, and the different skills are much more integrated. And an interesting question to ask is, why is that? And I think probably the answer is tradition as much as anything else. But that's an interesting point for you to bear in mind, and it has an effect on what you do in the classroom. Because if you teach listening in a discrete way, let's say just using pictures or questions in English, let's say, the danger is that then you do that in the classroom a lot to practice for the exam, and that means that you might use less target language in the classroom. That's known as the backwash effect, or washback effect, where the exam affects what you do in the classroom. So as a teacher, you need to weigh up the pros and cons of doing exam-style activities in the classroom. I think the issue of fairness is important here to bear in mind. Students are very quick to notice if something is unfair, and I think where reliability and fairness come in, it comes in this sort of case. For example, when you design a unit test or any sort of test, you want to design it so that if you have to allocate marks, you don't want too many marks at the lower end. So if the mark were out of 100, you wouldn't want half the class getting below 50% or below 40%. So ideally, if you design a test, you want to try and make it so that the range of marks is good enough so that you can discriminate between students, because often you have to do that, but where the marks are not too depressingly low and seem therefore unfair to students. So if you are marking to a percentage and your top student might get 100%, let's say, and your weakest students might get no lower than, say, 40 or 50. So bear that in mind. And another aspect of unfairness is when, for example, you've worked in a certain way in the classroom, you've done certain exercises, and then suddenly in the test, they get a different sort of exercise. And that's also unfair. I think you can also argue at the moment that in the GCSE exam in England, some of the tests are unfair, certainly in listening, because they just seem generally too hard. Even the very able students find them very testing. And the argument given for that by the regulator Ofqual is that they need a big range of marks to be able to statistically distinguish between candidates for their purposes. But that's a whole other issue. When it comes to assessment, schools need to monitor and track students, and schools do that in all sorts of ways. Certainly in England they use complicated flight paths, although the inspectorate in England, Ofsted, have no preferred system. If you're going to track, then ideally you need some sort of baseline test to begin with, and that's really hard in modern languages because students have come through from primary school with varying experience and sometimes very little experience. And when they arrive in your Year 7 class at secondary school, high school, it's very hard to assess what they can do. There is no reliable aptitude test or attainment test that can be set in Year 7. So if you put in students into different attainment groups at the start, you're relying on unreliable baseline tests, usually based on verbal reasoning or ability at English and comprehension of maths. So that could be an argument for delaying grouping by ability till later, if you choose to group by ability. I mentioned earlier that powerful backwash effect from exams, and this is particularly powerful in England, where the GCSE taken at 16 is so influential. And so what can happen is that because you want students prepared for the exam, you then alter your teaching to practice the exam format. I'll give you a little example. So, for example, I know there are schools that are, even with their beginners, doing an activity called the photocard activity, which appears at GCSE. And I personally would question how useful that is in Year 7. You can use photographs to produce very interesting activities at that level. But if you simply try and replicate the format of an exam that's going to be done about 5 years later, then I don't see the point in that personally. So I think the danger is that you end up being too slavish to the exam, and in the end you need to get students ready for that exam over 5 years. That doesn't necessarily mean doing so right from the start by doing the same sort of tests. And so, you can make an argument for saying that actual exam practice tasks could be left relatively late. And effective unit tests, by the way, because often they are used, ideally they should reflect the work you've done in the classroom. So a unit test task ought to resemble a task that students have done previously, and the best ones do actually in textbooks. So therefore the end of unit test feels like a normal routine classroom activity, but with that added little bit of zest that this mark counts for a bit more, shall we say. And needless to say, when it comes to regular testing, I've mentioned already the testing effect and retrieval practice, but spaced out regular testing is going to be valuable for you. Don't forget that famous Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. If we don't space out our testing, then the danger is that things get forgotten. So massed revision for an exam is good for that exam and has some use for future knowledge recall, but far more effective is being able to space out and get regular contacts with that area of knowledge or skill that you want to practice. So little and often is the phrase that's sometimes used, isn't it? So we know that memory is forged by repetition. The researchers tell us that the testing effect is powerful and that getting a degree of desirable difficulty is important when you retrieve information. So not too hard, but enough to make you think a bit and just push you a little bit further, and that's said to build more reliably embedded knowledge. Of course, every time you do a practice activity in a classroom, it involves retrieval. So there is a question to be asked, what is the difference between a test and practice? I mean, the researchers say that actually when it's a test, it is more powerful, and it may be because it has that extra sort of little aspect that's at stake, as it were. And, we want to make learning memorable all the time, and try and avoid, if you like, forgettable testing, forgettable, boring repetition. So that was a very quick overview of a very big subject, actually, assessment. And I hope if you're a new young teacher, that's given you something to think about and something useful to take away. And in the next session, I'm going to have a look at sentence builders, otherwise known as substitution tables. And in the meantime, do check out my book, Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher, and my books with Gianfranco Conti, The Language Teacher Toolkit, and our most recent book, Breaking the Sound Barrier. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Hope to see you again. Bye.